Ever feel like adulting should come with like a warning label?
Haha, wow.
Totally. So today we're diving deep into all those wild psychosocial changes that hit us in adulthood. Like, how do we go from stressing about our first apartment to suddenly kind of understanding why our parents did that thing?
It's a trip, isn't it?
The biggest one. We're breaking down the source material unit-3.pdf, which is basically an encyclopedia for all things adulthood. Think of this as our cheat sheet for those big milestones, and
Mm.
maybe how to recover from a few detours along the way.
I love that.
And of course, our expert is here to help us connect the dots. It's not just about getting older, but why it matters, especially for you listening right now. What's up with that?
Exactly. It's way more than just birthdays. It's like this whole intricate dance of how we evolve, those relationships we build or don't, our careers, even just what society expects from us at different points. It all kind of weaves together.
Totally. And our source material dives into this from all these different angles. We've got Erikson's stages of development, Levinson's seasons of life, which is just a cool name.
Right.
Even how those attachment styles we form as kids, way back when, can totally show up in our adult relationships.
Yeah.
Ever feel like your love life's on repeat?
Ooh, yeah.
This might explain why.
And the reading makes a good point, too, about how there's no one-size-fits-all roadmap. The contextual approach, remember that?
Yeah.
It reminds us that everyone's journey is going to be unique. Your background, your experiences, who you've got in your corner, it all blends together to create your version of adulting.
So true. We're talking about those classic milestones, right? Launching a career, maybe marriage, kids, or not. Facing the reality of, well, getting older, retirement, relationship shifting, finding new meaning in those later years. Whew, it's a lot. It's a lot to process. But hey, that's what we're here for, right? We'll break down these big, kind of intimidating concepts into bite-sized pieces you can actually use. Walk away with those aha moments. Love that. Okay, one thing that really got me was this whole social clock idea. Like, are we hitting these milestones on time? And how does that even affect our decisions about marriage, kids, all of it? So interesting. The reading mentioned that women who follow this more like masculine social clock, where it's career first, tend to report feeling more dominant, more independent as they age.
It's true. It jumped out at me, too. But it's not about saying one path is better.
No, for sure.
It's more about acknowledging the trade-offs. Like, yeah, focusing on career early on might mean a stronger sense of agency later, but it could also mean navigating different challenges if you decide to start a family later.
Finding what feels right for you, not some external timeline. Totally. The reading also got real about work-life balance, especially juggling family, and how much that can impact our relationships and honestly just our overall well-being. Those sandwich years everyone talks about, caring for kids and aging parents at the same time, it's real. It can be so tough.
It's intense. The source material doesn't sugarcoat that at all. But there's also this really uplifting side. It highlights the power of having those positive coping strategies, a strong support system, finding meaning in new roles like grandparenthood, mentoring. It's never too late for a whole new chapter, which I love.
Okay, so much good stuff there, but how do we even make sense of the psychology behind all these big life stages?
That's where those stage theories come in,
Right.
especially Erikson's work, which is a big part of the reading. He believed we face these very specific psychosocial crises at different points in life. Like, in young adulthood, it's all about that tension between intimacy versus isolation, building those deep, lasting bonds while also figuring out who we are as individuals.
Which makes sense, right? It's this time of massive change for a lot of people, moving out, maybe starting a career, figuring out who we are outside of our families.
And how we navigate this stage, according to Erikson, can have huge ripple effects later on. If we don't develop that capacity for intimacy, it might be harder to create those really trusting, supportive relationships later down the line.
That makes sense. So then we move into middle adulthood, and generativity becomes this huge focus, right? That urge to nurture the next generation, leave our mark on the world. It's pretty powerful.
And it can show up in so many ways. Raising kids is one, for sure.
Yeah.
But it might also be mentoring colleagues, volunteering, creating something of lasting value. There's no single right answer.
Which is cool. But what if we, miss that boat? What if we don't find that outlet for generativity? What did Erikson say about that?
He suggested it can lead to this sense of stagnation, feeling stuck, like we're not quite living up to our full potential. But it's super important to remember this isn't about judging anyone's path, right?
Of course.
It's more about understanding those deeper human needs and how they play out.
Absolutely. Understanding, not judging. Besides Erikson, the reading also talked about Levinson's Seasons of Life, which, again, such a good name.
The best.
And it really captures that feeling of going through these distinct periods of, like, stability and then major transition. It's like, whoa, what just happened?
Totally. And for Levinson, it was all about building this life structure, kind of a framework for our relationships, our career aspirations, everything, really.
And that framework, it's not fixed, right?
Yeah.
It changes and evolves with us as we grow.
Exactly. He talks about these key transition points, like that big shift in early adulthood, usually around 17 to 22, where we're really starting to solidify a vision for our adult selves, often fueled by those early dreams and aspirations.
And the reading made such a good point about how those early dreams can be so influenced by, like, what society expects from us, like that whole masculine versus feminine social clock thing.
It's wild how powerful those unspoken timelines, those expectations can be,
Yeah.
even if we're not consciously aware of them. Like women in their 20s might feel pressure to prioritize marriage and family, while men the same age might feel driven to establish their careers first and foremost.
And as we talked about earlier, those choices, they ripple outward. They affect our sense of self, our relationships, our overall happiness. It's a lot to juggle.
It is a lot. But even just understanding those influences can be so empowering. It helps us make choices that are more intentional, more aligned with our own values and desires, instead of just following some predetermined script that doesn't quite fit.
Yes, writing our own stories. Okay, speaking of stories, let's talk romantic relationships. The reading suggests that there's this fascinating link between our early attachment patterns and how we approach love as adults. Have you ever wondered why some people just seem to effortlessly find those lasting, loving partnerships while others keep hitting the same relationship roadblocks?
Oh, 100%. It's like, what is the deal with that?
Right. And attachment theory actually offers some really interesting clues.
So true. Those very first bonds we form with our caregivers, whether they're secure, avoidant, or resistant, those early patterns, it's like they create a blueprint.
It's like they get woven into our DNA almost.
Totally. Like they shape our core beliefs about how love works.
So if someone had, like, a really solid, secure attachment in childhood, their needs were met consistently, they felt safe, loved.
Chances are they'll approach adult relationships with that same sense of trust and security.
Yeah.
They're cool with intimacy, they don't freak out about being abandoned, and they're able to form those healthy, balanced bonds. It's like they have a head start.
Which makes sense, but then what happens when those early attachments were rocky? Maybe there was inconsistency, neglect, even rejection.
Yeah, that can make it way more challenging to build those secure, trusting relationships later on. Someone with an avoidant attachment style, for example, often coming from early neglect, might find themselves pulling back from emotional closeness, afraid of getting hurt.
And on the flip side, those with more of a resistant attachment style, which the reading said often develops from unpredictable caregiving, might really, really crave that closeness, but also constantly fear being abandoned. So it's like this push and pull.
Exactly. And while these patterns can feel like deeply ingrained, and they are to some extent, it's not a life sentence, thankfully. With awareness and effort, we can work through those early wounds and build healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
That is such an important message. Okay, let's shift gears a bit from those early years and jump into the thick of adulthood. Marriage, family, careers, all the good stuff.
Let's do it. The source material does a really good job of outlining that traditional family life cycle. Moving out, finding a partner, having kids.
The classics.
Right. But it also acknowledges that there's so much more diversity these days in how people are actually approaching these milestones.
So true. We're seeing more people choosing alternative paths, maybe delaying marriage, opting out of parenthood altogether, putting career first, or just figuring out how to blend it all in a way that actually works for them. It's not a one-size-fits-all anymore.
And that's exciting. But this shift away from that one-size-fits-all model also comes with a whole new set of opportunities and challenges, don't you think?
For sure. For example, our source material pointed out that while marriage rates have gone down lately, marital satisfaction actually seems to be going up from middle to late adulthood. What's your take on that?
Interesting, right? To me, it hints at the fact that the people who are choosing marriage now might be doing it from a more intentional place. Like they've built a stronger foundation, maybe with more shared values and goals.
That makes total sense. And for those who do become parents, that transition, as I'm sure we can all relate to, can be incredibly joyful, but also, wow, a whirlwind.
To put it mildly. The reading talks about all those classic challenges, sleep deprivation, a million new responsibilities, the impact on the couple's relationship, which is huge.
And let's not forget about the financial strain, which, let's be honest, is no joke these days.
Huge factor. But it's not all doom and gloom. It also really emphasizes the incredible rewards, that deep love, the laughter, the pride that comes with watching this new life unfold.
It's such a unique experience, and shout out to those who find fulfillment in roles beyond traditional parenthood too, right? Like becoming aunts and uncles, mentors, those bonus grandparents to their friends' kids. So many ways to nurture that next generation.
Absolutely. And those bonds can be so incredibly enriching for everyone involved.
Speaking of fulfilling roles, let's talk careers. Our reading dives into the challenges, but also those amazing triumphs of establishing ourselves in our careers, especially for women who are often navigating this really complex intersection of work and family.
It's a constant balancing act. Women are often expected to excel in their careers while also shouldering a huge chunk of the domestic responsibilities.
And that can lead to what our source material called role overload.
Oh yeah, that feeling of just being completely overwhelmed, stretched way too thin, and honestly just not happy.
It's so common, but the good news is it doesn't have to be inevitable. The reading talked about how a lot of women find ways to create a more sustainable balance, whether that's through flexible work arrangements, having a supportive partner, or just getting better at setting boundaries and prioritizing their own well-being, learning to say no more.
Which is so key.
So key. And it reminds us that we don't have to do it all alone, right? The reading really emphasizes how crucial those support networks are. Friends, family, colleagues.
Subscribe now.
We need those people to navigate the ups and downs of adult life, wouldn't you say?
Totally. Those connections are like gold for our emotional well-being, our resilience, even our physical health. They're a buffer against stress, a sounding board for our problems, and a constant source of, like, joy and just feeling connected.
And as we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive, those relationships just become even more precious as we head into those later stages of adulthood.
It's amazing how much our view of getting older has changed, right? Like it used to be all downhill after a certain point, but now it's more like the journey continues. Growth, change, we're always adapting.
So true. And the reading really emphasized that with successful aging, which I thought was interesting. It's not just about tacking on more years. It's about making those years good.
Exactly. Making the most of what's good, figuring out those inevitable losses, and facing it all with, a sense of purpose. Like, I've got this. I'm resilient.
I love that. And a huge part of that, according to all this research, is keeping those strong social connections, especially as we get older.
Oh, absolutely. Our social circles might get a little smaller as we age, but those connections we do have become even more important. It's that feeling of belonging, purpose, knowing you're not going through it all alone.
It's like those relationships deepen as we navigate these big life transitions together. The reading also talked a lot about finding new sources of meaning, identity, especially after retirement. What are your thoughts on that?
It's huge. I mean, retirement is a massive transition for so many people. And the research shows that those who really rock retirement, they've often found ways to stay engaged, volunteering, hobbies, traveling more, just spending quality time with loved ones, finding those things that spark joy and give them a sense of purpose in this new phase.
Yeah, makes sense. Retirement can be like this big blank page, and it's up to us to fill it in. And we can't forget about the joys and maybe a few challenges, let's be honest, of becoming grandparents.
Oh, for sure. It's a
What?
role that brings so much satisfaction for a lot of people. Sharing wisdom, getting to tap back into that playful side, making those memories with the next generation. It's pretty special.
It is. But the reading also made it clear that there's no one right way to be a grandparent. Like, those relationships can look really different depending on how close you live, cultural norms, even just personality.
Super true. Just like there's no one right way to do adulthood. It's about finding what works for your family, your dynamic, and cherishing those bonds. That's what matters.
It really does come back to those individual journeys, right? What makes your story unique? What are some of the things that surprised you or like the most insightful takeaways you found in all this research about how our paths unfold?
Oh, so much.
Yeah.
It really hit me that everyone's experience of adulthood is shaped by this incredibly complex mix of things. Your genes, how you were raised, your personality, the choices we make, even just the culture we live in. It's a lot.
And all those things can lead to some real changes in how we see the world, our priorities, even our personalities as we get older, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Like, remember how the reading talked about possible selves?
Yeah, yeah.
Those visions we have of who we might become in the future? Well, research actually shows that as we age, those possible selves get more, I guess, realistic, more grounded in what we've actually lived.
So instead of clinging to that childhood dream of being a rock star,
which, hey, some people achieve. Good for them.
Right, right. But for most of us, maybe we're more focused on things that feel more attainable. Finally learning that new language, deepening those relationships that really matter, or even just finding more joy in the little moments.
It's like this beautiful trade-off. As we let go of those youthful fantasies, there's this potential for so much more contentment and self-acceptance. It's powerful.
Like we finally grown into ourselves. Speaking of growth, the reading also really emphasized self-reflection as we get older. What resonated with you about that?
It's interesting how universal that seems to be,
Yeah.
like across cultures throughout history. The reading talked about things like reminiscence and life review,
Yeah.
basically different ways of revisiting our path, all of it, the highs, the lows, those hard-won lessons,
Hmm.
and then finding meaning in those experiences, the stories we carry.
It's like we're writing our own internal memoirs.
Totally. A chance to gather it all up and create a narrative that makes sense. It helps us understand who we are and how we got here.
And that process, according to the reading, can lead to this feeling of ego integrity.
Which is huge. It's that sense of wholeness, being content with the life we've lived, especially as we get closer to those later stages.
Like we're embracing all of it, right?
Right.
The good, the bad, the messy parts. And recognizing that we lived authentically, even with those inevitable missteps and regrets.
So well said. But the reading also acknowledged that it's not always easy to get to that place of peace.
It's true. For some people, acceptance is a process, and it's not always linear. What does the research say about those experiences when, maybe it doesn't quite click?
It talks about this potential for despair, those feelings of, oh, man, I wish I'd made different choices. It's too late now.
Which, I get it, it's a human response. When we're facing loss, the reality of our own mortality, it's understandable to have some regrets.
Absolutely. And that's why approaching aging with intention is so important. Building those healthy coping mechanisms, those strong relationships, and constantly seeking out things that bring us joy and purpose, even when things get tough. It makes all the difference.
It's about making each chapter count. Now, you mentioned earlier how everybody's journey is different. And the source material also looked at some of those key differences in how men and women tend to experience these later stages of adulthood. I thought that was really insightful.
It is fascinating. Like, for example, even though both men and women generally say they're pretty happy in their marriages later in life, the paths they take to get to that satisfaction, totally different.
So it's like, even though both men and women are generally content in those later life marriages, how they get there can look totally different. Tell me more about that.
Well, for men, it seems their social circles can really shrink after they retire, especially if most of their connections were through their job.
Makes sense, especially if they haven't had time for hobbies or other things they're passionate about outside of work.
Exactly. But women, they tend to keep those larger, more diverse social groups throughout their lives. Family, friends, being involved in their communities. We talked about this earlier.
So they're kind of ahead of the game when it comes to those social changes that naturally happen with age. It's like they've already been building those support systems all along.
Exactly. And those connections, like we've been saying, are huge for emotional health and finding that sense of purpose, especially as we get older.
It's about that feeling of belonging, of knowing you're not alone in this whole aging thing. Now, besides just social connections, the reading also pointed out some interesting gender differences in how we approach the emotional side of getting older, which I thought was fascinating.
It's really interesting, right? For example, it seems that as men get older, they often become more comfortable with their emotions, more willing to, be vulnerable, ask for support, that kind of thing.
Which is really interesting because for so long, those qualities have been seen as, I don't know, more acceptable for women to express. But here it seems like those roles almost flip as we age.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's not just that men become more emotionally open. The research suggests women, as they age, often feel more empowered to embrace those more assertive, independent parts of themselves, the traits that maybe weren't as celebrated when they were younger.
It's like those traditional gender roles we grew up with. They start to relax a little as we move through life. There's more room to just be ourselves, which, honestly, that's kind of inspiring.
It is inspiring. It
Yeah.
speaks to our ability to keep growing, keep changing, no matter how old we are. But we have to acknowledge that aging isn't all sunshine and roses. The reading got real about some of those practical challenges, too, which are important to talk about.
Right, like dealing with health issues that pop up, financial worries, maybe needing more help from others as we get older. It's a big adjustment for a lot of people.
Huge. And it can be really hard to navigate, especially for people who've always been super independent. The research really stressed how important it is to find ways to hold on to a sense of control, even when we're facing these new challenges we've never dealt with before.
So how do we do that? How do we maintain that sense of agency as things change?
Well, it might look like making proactive decisions about healthcare, being open to different options like assisted living, if that becomes necessary,
Mhm.
or even just finding ways to adapt our homes and our lifestyles as our needs change.
So it's about planning ahead, advocating for ourselves, being informed.
Exactly. But it's not just external stuff, right? That inner resilience is huge. Cultivating a positive outlook, practicing gratitude, staying close to those supportive people in our lives, all of that helps us ride the waves of aging.
It's about having those tools in our back pocket. And, we also have to acknowledge the people who dedicate themselves to supporting older adults, the caregivers, the healthcare workers, social workers. They're amazing.
They are. They provide such essential care, companionship, and make sure that older adults can age with dignity, even when things get hard.
Their work is so important, and honestly, I think a lot of times it's overlooked. Now, the reading also touched on some of the really tough stuff that can come up as we age. Things like elder suicide, the complexities of family caregiving situations. Those are hard conversations.
They are heavy,
Yeah.
but they're conversations that we need to be having more openly.
Yeah.
There's still so much stigma around these issues, and we need to create a more supportive environment for older adults and their families.
Absolutely. It's about making it okay to talk about those challenges without shame or judgment. Because at the end of the day, aging is something every single one of us will go through, if we're lucky, and it deserves to be met with understanding, respect, and a whole lot of grace. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by how much of it comes back to finding that balance between acceptance and agency.
That's such a good point. Recognizing that, yeah, we can't control everything about getting older, but there's still so much we can do to shape this experience and live well.
Finding that sweet spot between surrendering to the natural flow of life and at the same time taking steps to make this chapter as meaningful and fulfilling as possible.
And sometimes that means challenging those messages we've internalized, those
Yeah.
stereotypes about what it means to be old, like rewriting the script entirely.
Yes. So instead of buying into the idea that aging is all about decline and loss, we can choose to focus on.
The opportunities, the chance to keep growing, keep learning, stay connected to what lights us up.
Because let's be real, our culture doesn't always make that easy. It's all about youth.
Oh, I know.
You're constantly bombarded with this message that being young is everything. It's like youth equals beauty, vitality, worth. It's hard to push back against that.
It's true. But there's a growing movement to challenge those narratives, to redefine what it looks like to age gracefully, authentically, and on your own terms.
Yes. And part of that, I think, is simply recognizing the incredible wisdom and resilience that often comes with age. Like, these are the people who've seen it all.
Right. They've navigated so many challenges and come out stronger. They have so much to teach us.
They've witnessed crazy societal shifts, technological advancements. They have this perspective that gives us this incredible window into history, progress, just the human experience itself.
And it's true. And those stories, they can teach us so much about resilience, about adapting to change, about the enduring power of the human spirit.
Which I think goes back to that idea of generativity, that desire to leave something lasting behind. And it's not always about kids. It might be mentoring, sharing those hard-won lessons, making a difference in our communities.
And that feeling of purpose, knowing you've made a difference, it can be incredibly powerful, especially in these later chapters.
It's about finding ways to stay engaged with life, keep learning, give back, and nurture those relationships that bring us joy. It's what makes life worth living.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And the best part is, it's never too late to start.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into adulthood, what's that one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
That adulthood isn't some finish line you cross. It's an adventure. It's constantly evolving, always changing. And with a little intention, a little self-compassion, it can be an incredibly rich, rewarding journey, no matter what stage of life you find yourself in.
Beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on this incredible deep dive into adulthood. And remember, this is your journey. Embrace the adventure.
Subscribe now.